Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. I'm only really posting one video this week because I've spent this entire week researching this case. Because this case it's a shocking one. I had never heard of it before considering it's a Canadian case. This case takes place just outside of Toronto. But I found this case hard to research for the fact that I had to go through like multiple different sources and articles to compile the entire story, because I found one person who covered this case and they didn't have all the information, and then I found like an actual documentary that covered this case and they didn't have other information that this guy had, that I had to like then backtrack and see and like confirm if it was real or not, which it turned out to be. So it was just very confusing. I don't know if it's because things have been coming out over the last few years or what, but not everything seemed up to date. And there was a lot of information in this case, especially when it gets to the trial. There was a lot given out because I did find a reporter who was reporting on Twitter, actually, like a play-by-play of what was happening in court. So there was a lot of information there. But I think you're all going to be very interested in this case, and I'm surprised this case isn't bigger than it is, just from the shock value alone of how this killer was caught. But without further ado, let's get into the case. December 24th of 2017, David Wood and his family would move into the main floor of 19 McMillan Drive. This home was in downtown Oshawa, Ontario, Canada, which is a city just north of Toronto on Lake Ontario. The Wood family would meet their downstairs neighbor, who was a man living in the basement apartment below them, and they would offer him some cookies in the spirit of Christmas as a kind gesture. The next day was Christmas, and this downstairs neighbor would come up and ask David if he had a plumber snake, saying that his toilet had backed up. But a few days later, the plumbing situation would go from bad to worse, as now the sewer began to back up too. Now, I really feel for this family because they moved into this home on Christmas Eve, and then within a couple of days, their downstairs neighbor is clogging the drains. Not really ideal, but this is going to turn from an annoying neighbor and rental situation to a horrific one. This downstairs neighbor would end up telling David that he had flushed an inflated condom down the drain, and that's what was clogging up the drains, but he was dealing with it. At this point, David ended up offering his neighbor a snake to try to fix the drain, but he didn't want it this time. And eventually, this downstairs neighbor realized that this wasn't going to be the easy DIY plumbing fix he thought it was going to be. So when December 29th hit, he finally gave up and decided he was going to call in a plumber. When this plumber arrived, he entered this downstairs apartment unit and was met with a very messy, hoarded, awful-smelling apartment. But plumbers kind of see it all. My uncle's a plumber. He's told me some horror stories of places he's gone into. Not quite this bad, but still pretty bad. And this man was there to do a job. So he asked where the toilet was, he was shown where it was, and he began to try to unclog the toilet. But after working on it for a bit, the plumber started to pull up what he described as black sludge and something stringy. The tenant then began to act nervous and commented, "Oh, that's vile." Soon after, police would receive a 911 call from a plumber who was servicing a home, and this plumber claimed to have found pounds of what appeared to be a flesh-like substance clogging the drains.
Communications.
I'm a plumber and I'm on site for a job. We're snaking a drain, and we probably pulled back about 10 pounds, 15 pounds of like, it looks like flesh type of stuff, meat, and we don't know what it is. And I was talking with my boss, and he said for me to call this number.
Sorry, down the drain of what?
Of a house. It looks like flesh. We pulled out like 15 pounds, 10, 15 pounds of it.
What's the address, sir?
It's 19 McMillan Drive, and we started to snake, and we've been working at it for like 3-4 hours now, right?
Oh, okay.
And we can't get it clear, but we keep pulling back chunks of, whatever the hell it is. It's hard to describe other than it's just fleshy and muscly type of, and it was strips of it, upwards of like, one piece we pulled out was like probably about 18 inches long.
Police would arrive to 19 McMillan Drive in Oshawa around 7:30 p.m. and they would meet with this plumber who would end up showing them this fleshy substance that he was pulling from the drains. And he was removing large amounts. The officers would end up taking photos of this fleshy substance and sending it to their sergeant so that they could get his opinion on it. But police would soon determine that this fleshy substance indeed was parts of a human body. Remember how I just said that I was shocked that the story isn't bigger than it is? Well, it keeps getting worse. Realizing what they had found, officers, of course, wanted to speak to the tenant that lived in this apartment. And they were met by a man who shockingly would blurt out, "Okay, you got me. The gig's up, it's a body." He would then add, "If you want to find the rest of her, she's in my freezer, and she's pretty defleshed." But who was this strange man living downstairs, and why in the hell would he admit to possessing human body parts? This downstairs tenant would turn out to be 45-year-old Adam Strong, who had moved into the apartment in 2007. Over the years, Adam had worked as a gas station attendant at 2 different locations in Ajax and a film set security guard in Oshawa. He was described as very sure of himself. Cocky. He thought that he was smarter than he was. Adam also turned out to be very into BDSM. And as you can see by this Facebook post where he writes, "Home is where my handcuffs hang," he didn't really keep it a secret. Now, maybe it's just me, but Facebook's usually where your family is and stuff, so you really don't want to be posting your kinks on there. But I mean, hey, to each their own. We're not going to be kink shaming here, I guess. But in this case, I'm going to be kink shaming this man because he is, as you will find out, extremely vile. Adam also seemed to be very into writing online reviews for pornos and erotica books. His ex-girlfriends would also describe him as abusive and controlling. So Adam Strong is, of course, immediately arrested and charged with improper indecent interference with a dead body. But who was the she he was referring to in his freezer? How did she get there? And who was he flushing down the drain? To figure all of that out, we would have to jump back 4 months prior. On September 11th, which strangely is also the day I'm filming this right now, is September 11th, so rest in peace to everyone. But on September 11th of 2017, a man and his 11-year-old grandson would be fishing in the Oshawa Harbor of Lake Ontario, and they were near one of the popular beaches when they ended up discovering a human torso.
A gruesome discovery near a popular GTA beach.
We received a call from a fisherman. Our officers confirmed that a torso was found of a female.
The disturbing details police are revealing early in the investigation.
How long were you down at this beach?
For at least a week, because I had our PO unit, our ground search did the entire area.
And where was the torso found?
So right about 3/4 of the way up the pier. It's still a little bit of disbelief until I actually got down to the lake myself and witnessed what I saw. The officers had it all taped off of a crime scene. And as I got to the pier part of the harbor, as I looked down, I could see the torso on the harbor, kind of with 3/4 of the way down. It had been pulled out of the water and was sitting with a fishing net in the middle of the pier.
Police would end up determining from the flow of water in the area that this body had to have been dumped there directly. It wouldn't have washed in from somewhere else. But there were no scars, no tattoos, nothing to really determine who this body would have belonged to. And according to law enforcement at the time, whoever had dismembered this person seemed to have some kind of experience, possibly with a background in the medical field or maybe a hunter or a butcher. And they had determined this because the cuts were very, very clean. The body would end up being sent to an anthropologist, and after examining it, they would determine that the torso belonged to a female between the ages of 16 to 24 years old and provided, an estimation of weight and height of who this person may be. All of this information that the examiner ended up providing the police about the body would help the police narrow down through all of their missing persons reports who this body could possibly match. And 2 months later, after testing familial DNA, this torso would end up being identified as that of missing Rori Hache. At the time of her disappearance, Rori was an 18-year-old girl living in downtown Oshawa. She had grown up being spoiled by her mother since she was the only girl born in her mother's friend group. Her godmother, Christia, was her mother's best friend, and she was very close to Rori growing up too. She was very emotional while being interviewed with Crime Beat, recounting memories of when Rori was a little girl.
Shannon had taken her to Dollarama, and they had spent, on crafts and whatever, and Rori had come home, and she was like, "Auntie, look what I got." And she opened it up. She goes, "Guess how much it cost?" And I said, "How much?" And she goes, $21. And it's the way she said $21. If you ever heard it, you'd never unhear it. It is the most beautiful little $21 that you've ever heard.
So it got teenage years started to roll around, and that's when Rori started to get a little bit more free time on her hands. And I went back to work around that time. I was working for a restoration company through her grandparents' family. That's when I started losing a little bit of grip with, my girl, because her dad and I had separated already. And I was working 12-hour days, 10-hour days. And Rori was left, unfortunately, to make a lot of decisions on her own at 14 years old, 13, 14. Dancing was a passion of Rori's. Rapping was a passion of Rori's. But she loved her animals and she loved her family. She had big plans. She had big plans in life.
Turns out, however, that Rori came from a family with a big name. Rory's own grandfather was Bernie Gindin, who was a well-known Canadian outlaw biker, gangster, boxer, and had founded Satan's Choice, which is a biker's gang much like Hell's Angels, and he had founded this back in 1965. And this is a biker gang that I personally heard a lot about from my own family growing up because they knew people that were associated with this biker gang, or motorcycle club as they like to be called. But I was shocked when I ended up digging deep enough and I found that her literal grandfather was the founder of this club. I hardly ever hear about this biker gang talked about, so hearing it brought up in this case just feels very close to home. But even in current times, other family members of Rori's were still involved with biker gangs, including her uncle, Harley Gindin, who is a member of Hell's Angels. About a year before Rori's disappearance, her uncle said that she had been staying with him for a while with him and his family while he was under house arrest for one of his multiple charges. He had eventually given her and her mother $1,000 to help them with living expenses, along with buying Rori some clothing and shoes. It was also known to the family that within that year of her disappearance and murder, Rori was actually struggling with a crystal meth addiction, and she was spending a lot of time in the rougher parts of downtown Oshawa.
First week of high school, I feel that was the beginning of the end for us. I fell into the wrong crowd and started coming home with a different attitude, a different self-pride about herself. Like everything was just different within the first month. It was very noticeable. Even after some of the closest people to her mutilated her soul at 14, she still pushed forward. And she was good, and she didn't hold anything over anyone's head. And if she had an apple, she would split it 5 ways if there was 4 people in the room, you know. Rori, through experimenting with some substances, definitely became an even more changed person. And that's when I really started to struggle with keeping my hands on her heart, who she is. Because she was starting to be riddled with shame and guilt for things that other people had done to her, but she never brought any trouble back their way.
Before her disappearance, her uncle vividly remembers her hugging him a little too tightly, as if she knew something was wrong. But she never ended up asking her uncle for any help, so he didn't really know anything was wrong. In August of 2017, Rori would end up going to a dollar store with her aunt to buy a pregnancy test, but her aunt never ended up knowing the results to this test. August 29th would be the last time that her aunt seen her, and she noted that she seemed happy. Now, I'm just gonna say this now. I've seen 2 different versions of stories of how Rori was doing during this summer leading up to the time of her disappearance and her murder. On one hand, I seen that Rori was seeking help through a youth housing center called the Refuge, and that the Refuge had helped her get an apartment. But then I also seen that a worker there testified that Rori's condition was kind of deteriorating over the summer, and they had said that she had started using various drugs and that she had become withdrawn.
Some very fond memories of who she was. She was a spunky kid.
18-year-old Rori Hache, a mainstay here at Oshawa's The Refuge Youth Outreach Center. Months into her passing, the teen's memory is still cherished.
And if I think about memories of Rori and who she was, that attitude of just persevering, not giving up, getting knocked down, but picking herself back up and carrying on toward the goals.
During the summer, a police officer named Christopher Kane actually ended up running into Rori on an unrelated incident, and he had witnessed her wandering around a lot outside that summer and standing on street corners. He also noted that her hair had been cut kind of cropped like a child's, she had an injury on her hand, and she was using drugs. And at this time, she had allegedly told this officer that she would go on dates, I'm sure you know what that means, to pay for drugs. The officer had claimed to be very concerned about this young woman because, again, she was only 18 years old, and so he ended up speaking to his superiors about finding ways to help her out. And he had actually ended up finding a way to get her into some public housing, but when he went back to go find her to let her know, he couldn't find her again. Now, I heard a lot about her struggling this summer and the time leading up to her death, but then I also, on the other hand, heard a whole different version from her family, where it seemed like the last 6 months before she went missing, so that entire summer then, she was actually thriving. And according to her mother, she had started going to school again, she had a job, she had her own apartment, she even had a boyfriend named Tony. She seemed to be in a good place. Her mother, Shannon, was quoted saying, "I spoke to her or saw her every day. In August, she told me she thought she was pregnant and Rori was determined to keep the baby. I told her to do another test, but I supported her choice." But I don't think Rori was as set up as she was leading her family to believe. And after spending this whole week researching this this case and seeing all the different versions, I think she was definitely still struggling. And if she was addicted to drugs, people don't just get clean overnight. People that are addicted relapse a lot sometimes. And I think Rori, especially after finding out she was pregnant, she definitely wanted to better herself. She wanted to give her baby a better life maybe than she was having at that moment. But I think she was definitely still struggling, and I think it will make a lot more sense once we figure out what happened to her. It would actually be workers at the refuge that claimed that they were the ones that first noticed that Rori was missing. After not seeing her around for a while, they got worried and they ended up contacting her family. So on August 29th, Rori's aunt claims to have seen her and she seemed happy. Rori was also last spotted at a park in downtown Oshawa called Memorial Park. But on August 31st, after not hearing from Rori for about 3 days at that time, her godmother would end up contacting her mother, who was actually recovering from a very bad fire at the time, and she would tell her that she needed to go report Rori missing. So now jumping back to the end of December, Adam Strong is arrested and brought to the station for questioning. And the entire time, Adam is trying to be buddy-buddy with the police officers. He talked about serial killers, past girlfriends, his hobbies, religion, and how he definitely did not associate with drug addicts. And the interrogation footage, which there is a lot of, is shocking. Mainly just because how nonchalant Adam is in this interrogation room, considering that he has been caught with body parts in his apartment.
Adam, how you doing? Good, you? Had better days. Do you see how upset I am? No. You're pretty calm. Under the circumstances, I'm a little concerned how calm you are. There's no way of getting around that I chopped her up. There's no way. Okay. And I understand that. We weren't wondering if you chopped her up. It's obvious that I did. Yeah, if again, if not for apparently the plumbing was all up in that house. That aided in my capture and your capture. Yeah, for sure. You know, I was sitting down in my basement after the plumbers left, and I was like, "Am I gonna get out of this? I don't know. Should I leave now?" How much longer before it was? It was all done in one evening. Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Like this was all one piece, and then this was all one piece. I couldn't. Yeah. Really? Sorry, man. I don't remember. Really? Yeah. It wasn't important to me, man. She's definitely deceased. Yes. Yes. And you clearly have said, yeah, I disposed of her. Yes. Yes. Tried to. But unfortunately was foiled by inadequate plumbing. Yeah. And that's a freaking shame. Not for me. For me. Yeah, for you. Yeah. You sound really selfish when you say that. Sorry.
On top of that, this interrogation footage really pissed a lot of people off, especially when he is ordering his meal that the officers provided him. He is just so picky in it, wanting like this way, this that way, a little bit of this, little bit of that. It's just disgusting. This man clearly just doesn't give a shit.
What are you going to hanker him for? Wendy's triple. Yeah, that's doable. No pickles. Iced tea, no ice. 2, their value, spicy chicken wraps, and a grilled chicken Caesar salad. Okay. Is that outrageous? No, that's doable. Is there any way I can get a cigarette? Anyway, smoke is this? Oh, and a ranch and a Caesar? Oh my God, thank you.
On top of that, Adam even tells the officers in this interrogation footage that he had spoken to his lawyer and he wanted to give up all the information in exchange to be more comfortable in jail. And for example, get an allowance or maybe a TV or internet access, because he says he doesn't have anyone in his life that would buy him a TV. So maybe he just gives some information away, cut a deal, and then he'd, live out the rest of his sentence comfortably. But he would end up saying that his lawyer told them that this was a bad idea. I'm just gonna say it again, I'm shocked that even this interrogation footage hasn't gone viral before, because he is just indifferent. At one point, Adam would end up being shown a photo of Rori and he would make a comment saying that she was a beautiful young woman. Meanwhile, officers are actually discovering a pipe bomb in his apartment, and that would end up having to be disarmed by a bomb squad before any further searching could happen.
Tonight, a loud bang rang in the heart of an Oshawa neighborhood, the controlled explosion of a suspicious package at the scene of a suspicious death investigation for Durham Regional Police. Good evening, I'm Faiza Amin on McMillan Drive, and as you can see behind me, that is the house at the center of today's drama that also saw an evacuation of this story.
After it was safe, officers would end up beginning to search his disgusting apartment and would end up discovering a number of items in his freezer, namely a garbage bag with a dead raccoon in it, a garbage bag with 2 human arms and 2 femurs, a garbage bag with lower legs and feet, a garbage bag with a pelvis, and a garbage bag with a head in it. When officers would end up questioning Adam who was in his freezer, he would decline to answer. However, the officers already knew that the body parts in this freezer belonged to Rori because on the back of her ear, she actually ended up having a tattoo on it, and the head that they had found in the freezer also had the exact same tattoo. They needed to figure out, though, how Rori had died if they wanted to get a good solid charge on charging Adam Strong with her murder. It would turn out that that park that Rori had last been seen in on August 29th was actually only a kilometer away from Adam Strong's home. But getting this murder charge put together was taking a lot longer than the family wanted it to, and it started making the public question what else might be going on, much actually like what's happening right now with Richard Allen in the Delphi case. Why aren't they just prosecuting him, putting it away? Why are they still keeping the lines open with that case? With this case, they weren't just, getting the proceedings and stuff going. They were still also keeping this case very active, and it made the public question why. It would turn out that police had sent out a lot of evidence for DNA testing that was found in the apartment. One thing being what is called a Wyoming knife, which is a specialty hunting knife. And when the report came back from this knife, DNA would show that the DNA collected on the knife did not match Rori's, but it actually connected to a second victim. And this victim would turn out to be missing 18-year-old Kandis Fitzpatrick. And guess where the last place Kandis had been seen? At Memorial Park. The same park that Rori had last been seen in. So in 2006, 2 years before Kandis's disappearance, her father, William Fitzpatrick, ended up divorcing her mother and moving all the way to Alberta. However, Kandis didn't move to Alberta with her father, and she ended up staying in Oshawa. At one point, she had actually disappeared, and her father ended up going all the way back to Oshawa and finding her, and this is when she expressed that she actually wanted to live alone. I don't know why she wanted to live alone, only being like 16 or 17 years old, but it seems like there was a lot of trauma in her life and things that just aren't mentioned to the public. So I think it's a lot deeper, and there's a lot more that was happening with Kandis than anyone ever knew. But friends would testify that they were doing drugs with Kandis, and that they knew that she was selling her body for drugs, and that her drug of choice at the time was crack cocaine. At the time of her disappearance, much like Rori, Kandis was described as a drifter, not coming home for weeks at a time. She was dependent on drugs, and it is stated by her family that she became dependent on drugs after something very traumatic happened to her. Her father did say, though, that she would always call, and he always expected her to come home eventually, but he started to get worried when he hadn't heard from her in a while. William began searching for his daughter. He even made a Facebook group that ended up getting over 1,000 followers on there, and according to her father, he tried to report her missing in 2008 as well as 2009, but police refused to make her missing persons report due to her age as well as her lifestyle. I think it's ridiculous, and it happens way too often where a family member or a friend tries to report their loved one missing and then police brush it off because they're an adult. They might have just went on a joyride. Teenagers, they like to go and run away. It's ridiculous. And in this day and age, in 2008, it still shouldn't have been happening. That's stuff that you think happened back in the 70s. But again, at this point, nothing surprises me with the Canadian law enforcement, although I think they did a decent job in this case. Back in 2008, they should have done better, because it wouldn't be until 2010 that police would officially finally make this missing persons report for her father. On top of that, medical reports would show that Kandis hadn't received any care since March 20th of 2008. There was nothing to show that she was alive after 2008. And what's really sad is even after Kandis was missing for over 10 years, her father still believed that she was out there somewhere and she was going to come home. So as you can kind of gather by now, police had connected that both Kandis and Rori were living very similar lifestyles at the time of their disappearance, and they were frequenting the same areas in Oshawa. They were both said to be working in selling their own bodies and had essentially been homeless, even though they had very loving families, it seemed like. So we now have 2 teenage victims. Now, police need to figure out what Adam Strong did with Kandis's body, because they got blood on the knife, but all of the body parts that they found in the drain and in the freezer matched to Rori. Police would end up releasing that they wanted anyone who had helped or had any information on Adam Strong in towing his 18-foot boat to come forward, because as you can gather at this time, police connected that Adam had an 18-foot boat that he kept parked at his apartment at that house he lived at. They connected the dots that he had dumped her torso in the lake, but I don't think he had a vehicle because he had this boat parked in the driveway. They never mentioned a vehicle. So I don't know if anyone ended up coming out. I never seen anything talked about anyone coming out, but they were trying to seek information on that because they were kind of suspecting that maybe if he did this to Rori, that he did the same to Kandis. They also wanted to speak to anyone who had contact with them since the mid-1990s. So Adam Strong would now be being charged with 2 counts of murder. But there are still so many questions in this case. How did Adam meet these girls? What was their cause of death? And one would be answered fairly soon. A friend of Rori's would actually end up finding a photo that she'd taken of Rori and their friends in 2016. So a year before Rori even went missing. And she had taken this photo in a vacant lot near where the movie It was being filmed because all of the teenagers had gathered around. They wanted to watch this movie being filmed. But this photo is so chilling. And again, another reason why I feel like this case is just so incredibly scary and crazy and wild, because in the background of this photo where you can see Rori with her friends, Adam Strong is directly dead center in this photo because he was working as one of the security guards there. That is just so incredibly creepy and just such a weird circumstance that all happened. But what does that mean? Does that mean that Adam actually had a conversation with Rori a year prior to her murder and disappearance? Or is it just a big happenstance? Police would figure out, however, that Adam did like to frequent outreach centers, which were places that Rori and Kandis would also frequent, and one specifically was very close to Memorial Park. Things would take a turn very quickly when it would come out that Rori was actually caught on surveillance video on August 30th, so the day after her last sighting, and she was caught being dropped off by a friend and her friend's mother at the ER of a hospital. The two would end up walking Rori inside, but left shortly after, leaving Rori there alone. When a nurse that was working in the ER at the time was interviewed, she would say that Rori turned up asking for a prescription and acting very bizarre. But not long after, Rori would actually end up leaving the emergency room without actually even seeing a doctor. So this now would be the last time Rori was actually seen alive, and this would be the last video footage of her ever alive. During further interviews, Adam would actually end up slipping and admit that he knew Rori was sleeping in a tent near Oshawa Creek, which was by his home. And I'm like 99.9% sure this is true, that she was sleeping in this tent by this creek, because location data would eventually show that Adam had crossed over to Oshawa Creek Park where Rori was allegedly staying, and then he would return home. So it's assumed that that's when he went over to Rori and he propositioned her for sex and brought her back to his home. Adam would then not leave his home for 36 hours, and this is when it's thought that he either kept Rori alive for all that time and then killed her, or he killed her and he spent all that time dismembering her. Then on September 4th, his GPS would actually be turned off on his phone, and this is when police suspect that he was dumping her torso in the lake. Adam would also admit that he had taken Rori out to dinner at one point and he knew she was selling herself. He'd claimed that Rori had actually visited his home, but she had always left on her own free will. Now, again, knowing all of that, if she wasn't still struggling, why would she be sleeping in the tent and then going to this very creepy man's home? Unfortunately, I do think she was trying to better herself, but she was still struggling. So clearly there was so much and more going on in Rori's life that we probably will never know or understand. And I just wish that this young 18-year-old girl could have seen the light at the end of the tunnel and lived a beautiful life with her and her child and had a story of overcoming all that she had went through. But unfortunately, a disgusting, disturbing man named Adam Strong ripped that away from her and her unborn baby. And Adam Strong would continue to go on and prove how just disgusting and disturbing he was, because he would go on to say that he had started dissecting the flesh from Rori's body on Christmas Eve, the night that family moved in upstairs. And he said that he started doing this because she was taking up a lot of room in his freezer. He had also stated that after flushing all of her flush down the toilet, he had planned to throw her bones in the lake, but he had gotten all caught up by this plumbing situation. And he'd say all of this very nonchalantly. When it came to Kandis, though, police were having a very hard time getting anything out of Adam. He would admit, however, that he did know what DNA would be on what items in his home that would belong to which victim, but that he hadn't used the Wyoming hunting knife on Rori because he didn't even think of it. He would also admit that keeping that hunting knife was a mistake, but he was a procrastinator and it was a detriment to himself. Adam's double murder trial would begin in September of 2020. And of course, he pleaded not guilty on both first-degree murder charges. His lawyer would also ask for a trial by judge and not by jury. This was agreed to as long as they would do one trial for both charges opposed to 2 separate trials for each girl. And luckily they were granted it because it was really smart of them to try to just do the one trial because there wasn't much evidence on Kandis's murder. So if her trial stood alone away from Rory's, it would have been really hard to convict him for hers. So as I said, I found a Twitter thread from a reporter named Catherine McDonald who reported a play-by-play of the court proceedings, and she revealed a lot of information of what was being released during these court proceedings. So again, I'll have that link down below in the description if you want to see every play-by-play detail, but I'm going to sum it all up because there was a lot, and it was very disturbing. A lot more disturbing than I've already described. So if you don't want to hear this stuff, I'd skip ahead, click out. But I think it is very vital information to understand how disgusting and disturbing and dangerous a man like Adam Strong truly is. So Adam would describe using Rory's torso as a cutting board, saying he held her reproductive system in his own hands. He was also shocked that her torso had floated, saying that it shouldn't have, which honestly makes me question how he would know this. Has he thrown other torsos in the ocean and he's witnessed them sinking and he's never been caught for them because they never floated up, and that's why he's so insistent that her torso shouldn't have floated. This is also the time when Adam would admit that on Christmas Eve, a time when families come together to spend a loving time together and, share gifts, Adam was defrosting Rory's remains in his bathtub and then deflushing them and refreezing them. It would also come out in trial that police had discovered blood splatter throughout Adam Strong's very messy and hoarded and disgusting apartment, along with air mattresses, an extensive list of sex toys, including a BDSM-style spreader device with handcuffs that also had blood on it. Blood was also detected on the mattresses. Rory was also found to have bruising on her face, assuming to have been struck in the face. She also had scalp injuries, likely from a hammer or a crowbar, but experts said that they could not determine if those were caused pre or post-mortem. Tests would also reveal that Rory had the presence of drugs in her system at the time of her death, including meth and cocaine. During Rory's autopsy, semen would be found on her remains, and blood evidence would conclude that Rory was wearing some sort of restraint device at the time of her death. Most likely, probably that spreader device that had the handcuffs on it. All of this would lead to the conclusion that Adam had most likely went over to where Rory was staying at that tent by the creek, propositioned her for sex, brought her home to his basement apartment where he then restrained her since he was into BDSM, handcuffed her, and then he proceeded to essay her and murder her. On top of that, at the time of her murder, there was no one living upstairs in that upstairs apartment, so no one would have heard Rory even screaming, which is, it just gives me the chills. It's just so fucking terrible. This man is disgusting. He would have known no one was living up there. He knew she could scream as loud as she wanted to, and no one would have come to help her. Because remember, that family didn't move in until months after Rory was murdered. In the end, the judge came to the conclusion that Adam had essayed and murdered Rory, and he'd find Adam guilty. Adam Strong would end up being convicted for the first-degree murder of Rori Hache, but he would actually be acquitted for Kandis Fitzpatrick's murder, and instead the judge would only find him guilty of manslaughter for Kandis, and this was due to lack of evidence. The judge would find that Rory had died from blunt force trauma to her head, likely from a hammer or a similar object. So in the end, Adam would end up with 25 years for Rory plus 18 years for Kandis, but this was to be served concurrently. In the end, Adam tried to blame his childhood and his upbringing for why he became a murderer. He would tell detectives, "They are my actions, but I don't think I would have made those actions if I had been nurtured. It was a really bad childhood." And when asked if he had any remorse for what he had done, he would say, "I don't know. I'm kind of over it," because he is a fucking asshole. On top of that, this piece of shit wanted to offer his condolences to Rory's family, the family of the girl he murdered. And he also said he only felt bad because he got caught. Like, what a slap in the face. I think something really powerful yet scary that Rory's godmother was quoted saying was, "If there's one Adam out there, there's another one somewhere." Now, after all of that, I really want to make it clear that I think cases like this are really important because people need to remember that just because someone's life has taken a turn, that they have an addiction, that they have felt like they need to resort themselves to selling their bodies on the street, that these people had lives before their addiction, that they still have lives during their addiction, and families that love them, people that love them. Especially in this case, Rory and Kandis were only 18. And it seems like their lives only took turns very soon, within a couple years or a year before their deaths. Before that, they had lives. They were people who had dreams and aspirations, and they could have gotten out of these dark places in their lives that they were in. But Adam Strong took that away from them, and they did not deserve anything that happened to them. And seeing pictures of Rori and Kandis's childhoods, which weren't so long ago, they were only 18 years old. It really makes that sink in, I think. November of 2021, so just a year ago as I'm filming this video, Kandis's body would finally be found in a small wooded area near Secreto Drive and Britannia Avenue East in Oshawa. And I am so happy that Kandis's family finally can get some closure. They finally found her body. But finding her body has left me with a lot of questions. I'm really curious if they were able to determine her cause of death, even though it's been so long. How long he possibly kept her for before he murdered her, because she was missing for so long. It makes me wonder, did he keep her for a while because he was into all of these weird, creepy sex things? Or did he do what he did with Rori, and it seemed he only kept Rori for a small amount of time before he did murder her? But it leaves me with a lot of those questions. I didn't really see anything answered, so I'm not too sure. If you have any information on that, let's chat about it down below. But this is kind of like a more recent development, so I didn't see much on it. On top of all of that, there's even a more recent development, because in 2022, this year, investigators would return to 19 McMillan Drive in Oshawa after a contractor who was working on the home found some suspicious clothing. Police would end up sending these suspicious items for testing, but I haven't seen anything released yet on if anything came back for them. But this did, however, fuel the theory that Adam Strong possibly has more victims. And I kind of agree with this theory, because it is strange that he left such a big gap between Kandis and Rori, and it leads people to speculate, did he have more victims between those times? And was Kandis even his first victim? Because he got away with Kandis's murder for so long. And this man isn't the smartest man in the world. So how did he get so meticulous that he got away with Kandis's murder if that was his first murder? Did he just get lucky? I don't know, because he only got caught for Rori's murder and then also Kandis's murder because he made a mistake of trying to flush her flesh down the drains and it got clogged. It was just like a happenstance. Like, he didn't really know that was going to happen. He thought, okay, I'll just flush some and it'll get washed away and no one will ever know. It's not like he was actively trying to get caught. But what do you all think about that? I'm really curious if you all think he has more than these two victims. But in the end, I want everyone to keep Rori and Kandis in their thoughts, because these two young women did not deserve what happened to them. And this isn't the first time that we've heard of serial killers or murderers going after the more vulnerable in our society, and I don't think it'll be the last we hear of it. But it's the fact that law enforcement and the media don't take it seriously, and I find they don't respect the people and their families. And I think these cases need to be more talked about, because, again, these victims are people. They were people. They had lives, they had goals, they had dreams. And I think talking about these cases will make them less stigmatized, and it will bring more attention to things like this and hopefully help stop things like this from happening. Because as we know, Adam Strong frequented the places that these more vulnerable people frequented, and he was preying on them. On top of that, police are still asking, to this day, if you had a family member that has gone missing in the Oshawa area or in Ontario, that you contact them if you think Adam Strong could possibly be connected to their disappearance. Obviously, you need to have some kind of evidence towards that. But the fact that police are still keeping this open really makes me think, just like the Richard Allen case, that there is more to this case that is going to come out in the near future. And if it does, I will keep you all updated on it. With that, I hope everyone stays safe out there. I will see you in the next video. I'll try not to keep as big of a gap, but again, this case had so much information. I wanted to make sure I told it right, and I don't want to just throw things out that are quick and short that are just not as well researched. So I hope you understand that, and I hope you will still subscribe and turn on the notification bells so that you do get notified when I post. But I will continue to post. I'm not posting. I'm just, some cases I want to put more research into and more time into, and other cases are going to be quicker. There's not as much information, or it's faster to find the information. So yeah, I just want to make a point of that. I don't want people thinking I'm not posting, because I'm not posting like every other day sometimes. Sometimes I'll be posting every other day. Sometimes I'll be posting once a week. It'll just depend on the case and how much time I have with work and everything. But I still am here wanting to tell these cases and these people's stories. So with that, I hope you all stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.